Hi, everybody. My name is Curtis Mitch. I'm here with the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, and welcome back to another one of our weekday reflections on the daily Mass readings. Today is Monday, December 28th, and today is a feast day in the church. It's the Feast of the Holy Innocents, where we look back and remember that there are children who lost their life just because Jesus was born. The reading today, which tells us about this, is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verses 13 through 18. And as I said, today's Gospel is the story of how Herod the Great, who's ruling in Jerusalem, sent soldiers to the sleepy town of Bethlehem, this small little village 5 miles south of Jerusalem, to slaughter all of the infant boys because he feared that his own kingship was in jeopardy. He feared that a rival was being born who would overthrow him. And so today's gospel really gives us, in a sense, the dark side of the Nativity story. And it's a reminder, I think, that, Jesus, when he was born into the world, was not welcomed by the world. It was, it reminds me of a passage that appears in the prologue of the Gospel of John, where Jesus came to his own, and his own received him not. But even from the very beginning, there's resistance to Jesus. There's a desire to eliminate him, to unsheathe, in this case, unsheathe a sword against him. Okay, and of course that is a theme that will eventually reach its climax at the end of the gospel. All right, but even here, during the infancy, right after Jesus is born, we have Herod the Great representing the world, the flesh and the devil, evil, going after the goodness that has just entered our world. Now, the story of the Holy Innocents is actually a story of the first martyrs of Christian history, even before the stoning of Stephen in Acts chapter 6, or even before the beheading of James the Apostle in Acts chapter 12. We already have these youngsters shedding their blood for Christ right here in the story of the infancy itself. So let's look at today's gospel passage, beginning in Matthew chapter 2, verse 13. Now, when they had departed, and they is a reference to the Magi, the wise men who came from the east. They had come to Jerusalem in search of the newborn king of the Jews, right? The chief priests and the elders said, well, where's the Messiah going to be? He's going to be born in Bethlehem because of a prophecy that comes from Micah chapter 5, that the ruler of Israel would be born in the small town of Bethlehem, which is the hometown of King David. And so Herod sends them along, and the wise men go to Bethlehem, they find the baby Jesus, and they offer him gifts. And at this point, they're leaving the scene, and Herod finds out about it. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt. And he remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, Out of Egypt have I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, was in a furious rage. And he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time which he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they were no more. So what is going on here? Let's just look at a couple of the basics so we can get a sense of what the evangelist is trying to tell us. First is the antagonist. First is the villain. That's Herod. Herod, in this particular episode, is Herod the Great. He was proclaimed the king of the Jews by the Roman Senate in 40 BC. And he reigned in the land of Israel mainly from Jerusalem, over at least the southern part of the land of Israel until about 4 BC or possibly 2 BC. We're not quite sure, but he reigned for almost 40 years in the land of Israel. And history remembers Herod really primarily for 2 things. Number 1, he was a great builder, and number 2, he was a ruthless ruler. He was a great builder because he sponsored all kinds of construction projects throughout the land of Israel, right? He built cities, he built monuments. But the one thing that he is most known for is for renovating and expanding the great temple in Jerusalem, making it one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Herod spared no expense. In about 20 or possibly 19 BC, he began renovating the temple on a grand scale. And so the temple that Jesus prays in, the temple that Jesus cleansed, the temple that Jesus was teaching in, that's the Herodian temple, named after Herod the Great. He's the one who expanded it and beautified it in such a remarkable way. That's the Herodian temple from Herod the Great. Now, Herod was also remembered, as I said, as a ruthless ruler. He's someone who used violence to maintain his rule. In fact, and really no one was safe from Herod's sword, because he had one of his own wives murdered. He had 3 of his own sons murdered because he seemed to suffer from a sort of paranoia that others were going to usurp his throne. Others were going to unseat him and take his kingdom away from him. So what we see in Herod in the Gospel of Matthew is something that very much coheres with what we find in other ancient sources. For example, in Josephus, his Jewish Wars, a great book that was written in 7 books, almost the whole of the first of those books is devoted to the life and career of Herod the Great. And the picture there fits very much into what we find here in Matthew 2. But let's move now from Herod the villain to the holy innocents, who are the victims. Unfortunately, we don't know very much about them. We're only told that Herod had them strike down the male boys in Bethlehem and the region who were 2 years old or younger. Now, that seems like he's casting the net kind of widely. Wasn't Jesus just born? Well, we don't actually know precisely when this episode took place. In fact, we know it was sometime after Christmas, because we know that the wise men came to Jesus sometime after Christmas morning, okay? When you read about the Christmas story where Jesus is laid in a manger in Luke chapter 2, okay, the Holy Family could not find accommodations in the inn, and so they were given a stable, and there Jesus was born. But at this point, in Matthew's infancy story, you might say that their accommodations were upgraded a bit, because we find Mary and the child in a house when the wise men come. So it's sometime after. We don't know if it was a full 2 years after. It would seem unlikely that it was that long afterwards. However, nevertheless, Herod, just to be safe, wanted to make sure that if he was going to eliminate this newborn king of the Jews, someone who aspired to his title, who would take over his reign, at least that's the way he looked at it, he was going to make sure that he didn't miss anyone. And so all of the boys from 2 years old were slaughtered by Herod's soldiers. Now, this tragedy that takes place at the beginning of the gospel actually anticipates the tragedy that appears at the end of the gospel. We're talking about the crucifixion of Jesus. All right, and this is why the church regards these holy innocents in Bethlehem as martyrs, because these young boys were conformed to the image of Christ crucified even before Christ was crucified. They shed their blood for Jesus even before Jesus shed his own blood. So what you have in this episode is an instance of foreshadowing. Okay? It points us forward to the end of the gospel, when the sword unsheathed against Jesus actually takes his life, when the powers that be in Jerusalem actually put him to death, unknowing that he is redeeming the world, that he is the Lamb slain for our salvation. Now, third thing that I want to look at here is the infant Jesus himself. Again, Jesus, because he's just a newborn baby, is not a speaking character in this story at all. He just appears with his mom and dad, and they're taking him to different places. But who does Jesus appear as in this particular episode? Jesus appears as one who fulfills the Scriptures. And in fact, Matthew, the evangelist, draws our attention to two Old Testament passages in particular that he says is fulfilled in the events surrounding what happened in Bethlehem. And these two passages are rather curious because they appear to be historical rather than prophetic. In other words, they're both telling us something about events that happened in the history of Israel. They're not formulated in such a way that they're prophesying the Messiah. But we'll see, for Matthew the evangelist, this is actually a significant thing theologically. All right? So what Matthew wants to tell us, as we'll see here, is that Jesus is reliving the history of Israel. He's retracing the steps of his own people because he's about to bring their story to its climactic fulfillment as the Messiah, as the anointed of the Lord. All right, so what are these two passages? The first one appears in verse 15, where Matthew the evangelist says, "This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet." This is when the Holy Family flees to Egypt. He says, this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt have I called my son." Now, this is a quotation that comes from one of the Old Testament prophets, the prophet Hosea, chapter 11, verse 1. And Hosea is actually looking backwards into the history of Israel at this point. Out of Egypt I've called my son. He's talking about the Exodus, that the people of Israel collectively, according to the book of Exodus, chapter 4, are God's firstborn son. Israel is God's collective son. And when God rescued Israel from slavery in Egypt, he brought them out into the wilderness and then eventually into the promised land. He was saving his son. His enslaved son was liberated, freed, and given a new homeland. All right? But Matthew, the evangelist, now looks at this in terms of Jesus going to Egypt and anticipating the fact that he's going to come back out. So this prophetic text, which looks backwards, Matthew is suggesting is something that also looks forward to the time of the Messiah himself, because the Messiah is going to retrace those steps of his people. Right? Jesus is going to relive the Exodus, all right, in preparation for bringing that story to completion. So that's the first passage that he quotes from Hosea 11:1. The second passage appears in verse 18, and this is a quotation from Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15. "A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they were no more." Now, what's going on there? Jeremiah is speaking very poetically. He's speaking about the weeping of Rachel. Rachel is the wife of Jacob, right? One of the matriarchs of Israel. If Jacob is the father of the people of Israel, because it's his 12 sons who grew into the 12 tribes of Israel, then Rachel is the great matriarch. She's the mother of Israel, you might say. And she's weeping. Why is she weeping? Well, in Jeremiah's context, this place that is named here, Ramah, was an assembly point for the exile. If you remember in the early 6th century, when the Babylonians invaded the land of Judah, they conquered Judah, they destroyed the city of Jerusalem, and they set fire to the temple of the Lord, destroying it utterly, and killing indiscriminately, but then those who survived were hauled off into exile. And Ramah was an assembly point where the exiles of Judah were gathered up, chained together, and then marched off into exile. All right? Now, that's the first thing. The second thing is this. The reason why Jeremiah can hear the voice of Rachel crying out at Ramah is because one of the two traditions that appear in ancient Israel has Rachel being buried in Ramah. That's one of the traditional sites of her burial. Except I say one of the traditional sites because the other traditional site that we read about it in the book of Genesis is that Rachel was buried in Bethlehem. All right. Rachel then is the figure who connects these two places, the Bethlehem of the gospel story and the Ramah of Jeremiah's oracle. And so what's Jeremiah really saying? Why is Rachel weeping? Why all this lamentation? Well, because of two things. One, death on a massive scale. All of the bloodshed that accompanied the Babylonian invasion of the land of Judah in the early 6th century led to the death of millions, well, thousands at least, of Israelites, of Judahites. And those who survived didn't get off much better because they were hauled into exile. And Matthew sees that event in the history of Israel kind of recapitulated. It's happening again in a different way with the Messiah. You have the death of all of these children in the land of Israel, in Judah, all right, by a king who unsheathes the sword against them. But then you also have survivors. In this case, you have one survivor, but he doesn't get off well. It's the baby Jesus, and he goes into exile, like his ancestors went into exile. And so Matthew sees Jesus reliving the Exodus, but then also reliving the Babylonian exile, these calamitous, remarkable events that really mark and define the history of Israel. These are now being relived by the Messiah because he's going to bring this story to its fulfillment. Jesus brings the story of Israel to its climactic moment of salvation. He's gathering up all of the purposes of God throughout all of salvation history, and he's about to die as the Lamb of God who will take away the sins of the world. All of that is foreshadowed. We're put on a trajectory towards the passion narratives already here in the nativity narratives of the Gospel of Matthew. I hope this reflection was of some help to you today in understanding the gospel reading. I pray that God blesses you, your family, and your day, and I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Thanks.